let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the award-winning podcast where we talk about gaining, feedism, and everything in their orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim. So let's get into it. Today we're continuing our series of dinner table talks. We've got a few guests with us, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves one by one.
Hi, I'm Bobby. Instagram, I'm Lazy Susan, laissez like laissez faire. You might recognize me from the In Bulk episode, which has come out at this point, and I'm very excited to be here.
I'm Matti, online as the Gainin Project and other things. I was from the episode Art Before Swine.
Hi everyone, my name is Cam. I go by biggerisbest7 on Instagram, and you will remember me from the episode about gainer art.
Fabulous. Well, thank you everyone for making time to chat with us today. We're really excited to get into this episode, and I feel like we end up saying this a lot. We're very excited to get into it, but we are, because I feel like when we look at the back end of things, it's usually our conversations on like relationships and connection that end up being some of our most listened to episodes. So I think that means that within the community, within the listenership, there's a real desire to come to grips with how we approach connection and relationship as gainers and feedies. So let's just get into it from the top. Like, as individuals, we have all had dalliances, experiences, relationships with, I imagine, a mixture, right? Some of us have had the opportunity to partner with other gainers. Some of us have only been exclusively with civilians. But at the top of the episode, I want to inquire for your, as participants in the gaining sitch, when it comes to the idea of a relationship, what would you say are some of the key things that you would be looking for in terms of that fulfillment?
I think that the person probably would need to have a good relationship with food in general. They don't specifically, for me, need to be like a gainer or into it. Obviously, I would assume that if we were in a relationship, they would be attracted to larger bodies. So I feel like that would go unsaid. But just like a healthy relationship to food, not like a chicken tenders and French fries kind of guy. You know what I mean? Like with like somebody who's maybe adventurous in that way. How about y'all?
I think for me, the biggest key, like with any relationship, like for me, it's just always about communication. Someone who can communicate what their desires are and whether or not they're able to achieve them with you, and being like realistic in that pursuit. So that would be where I'd start from and kind of grow from there.
I think for me, it is like certainly the relationship with food. I mean, I think when you start to get into the particulars, everyone kind of has the different ways that they enjoy engaging with gaining, and it's very multifaceted. But I think that a big part of it comes down to, it's sort of like, I'm sure everyone's heard the meme at this point, like, matching your freak. It's like, are you matching your freak? Like, is this the way that you want to engage in this kink in a way that makes both of you happy?
So, like many people in the gainer community, I'm already partnered, and I'm partnered with a civilian. And that's probably because just locale, it's where I have lived has never really been very conducive to meeting up with other gainers. I think the reality of the situation is that a lot of us will end up being with civilians because, yeah, there's maybe a couple of 100,000 of us on Grommr, but that's like a drop in the ocean compared to a country's population or world population. So hopefully, whatever relationship you get into, they at least don't begrudge your kinks. They don't think that they're gross or weird. They're supportive enough to allow you to explore them. And like a lot of gainer civilian relationships, they are open. I mean, I'd say it's probably an even split between the ones that are open and the ones that aren't, because that's kind of like reflecting the major queer population at the moment.
Mm.
Certainly reflecting on my own relationship, similarly partnered with a civilian, I think sometimes it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. It's like, well, what are we founding this relationship on? Is it needing to have a root in gaining and then the relationship follows, or does it need to have a root in a relationship and hoping that the gaining follows? And I think, sometimes people can get a bit caught up in that and not really know where to move in terms of what needs to be the priority. But I think, much like you were saying, Tim, regardless of whether or not your partner is a civilian or a gainer, that person needs to have done some kind of work to unpack some of that sense of fat phobia. You know, Bobby, you had mentioned they need to have a good relationship with food. And certainly in the queer community, that is not always the case. We are existing at a time of Ozempic positivity for a lot of people. And so that would also require some amount of unpacking. And how one even gets there, it can be different for different people. We often come back to this point with the pod as well. Sometimes we can be so pro-gaining and forget that, you know, for example, if we're dealing with a civilian who is plus size, that person probably doesn't have a root of positivity in their size. That person has a history where they are themselves unpacking and navigating this kind of stuff. So, you know, sometimes I think the kernel of what we need to look for is someone who is self-aware of size and plus-sizedness, someone who has a sense of awareness when it comes to just the melange of everything that kind of goes on. And much like all relationships, that partnership is really a journey together. So someone who is willing, when you present them with ideas of who you are, willing to work with that, willing to come to understand that and go on that journey with you, even if they're not engaging. At least that's how it's thankfully panned out for me and how I would see it maybe working out for other people. But I want to thank you all for sharing some of those insights. I think that's all very, very good stuff. People who need to be aware, basically, before you really, really move forward. And I want to inquire here for people who are willing to share what y'all's experiences have been like when it comes to dating, as much or as little as you wish to give, if you feel that it's been successful in enmeshing gainer ideals, or if it's potentially maybe been a bit challenging, and maybe what some of those surprising challenges have been.
Yeah, I'll go first. I would say, I mean, it has unfortunately not been the most successful. Part of that, the reason for that is I've been in school, and law school in particular has been quite hellish, not the best time for relationships in general, but certainly just being online and trying to like make connections, being active in the community, great for making friends, not so great for like it going beyond that. And I think part of the difficulty is when you're looking, I think, or at least I don't know if others agree, I've always kind of approached gaining with, I think people have sort of like a vision of like what gaining means to them. When we were younger, we had like the different fantasies, and as we've gotten older, they've evolved and they've changed. But we sort of have like a core, like, what does this kink mean to me? What do I enjoy from that? And I'm just trying to find someone who sort of feels the way that I do about gaining, but like from the opposite standpoint of being a gainer themselves. And just and looking for that has been not easy. So I would say it's been kind of difficult. Had my share of fun, never to the level of a relationship though.
Wait, so what is, I'm sorry, since this is the first time we're meeting, what kind of is your relationship to gaining? Would you say you're more of like a feeder encourager? Like,
Yeah,
where are you on that spectrum?
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have said that. Yeah, more of like feeder encourager. I like to use the term enabler, but it's all semantic at the end of the day. But it's, yeah, from that angle.
Okay, cool. Interesting. I have had a past relationship with a man of size who didn't have like the healthiest relationship with his own body image, and that was something that was challenging to that relationship. We were together for about like nearly 7 years, I want to say. So, and it was interesting navigating, like, because okay, for the sake of the conversation, I would identify as a gainer in both muscle or fat. So it kind of just vacillates between the two. And while I was navigating like an attraction to my growing body, having to deal with his kind of like negative energy towards his own body that I found attractive was something that was kind of like a constant hurdle that we were jumping over in the relationship. And I think that led to like a little bit of like internal strife, if that makes sense. So having a good relationship to that, I think, is key, as you were saying before, James. And then I'm in a new relationship. We're about to, I think, get to at the end of this month, it'll be 2 years. And that was like, he's not, I think he's more of an admirer really than any other part of the gainer world. But that has been so much easier in being able to navigate that sort of like entering the fetish into the relationship, or just kind of like an understanding of what's going on with my relationship to my body, if that makes sense.
I'm coming from a background that's similar in a lot of ways. I was in an abusive marriage for about 8 years and have been out of that for roughly 2. I've been dating someone for also 2 years, and it's been a very unique experience because we're both technically on the asexual spectrum, and gaining doesn't really play a part in our relationship, but obviously it's a part of me and my fetishes. But because we don't play together in that way, it's been an interesting navigation between balancing like our needs for each other and having a relationship that's not directly linked into sex. And because it's not directly linked with sex, the fetish part of it is something that can kind of blossom on its own. So it's been a very interesting experience where we're both very happy. It's working really well, but it's not based on something typical that most people would expect it to be based on. So it's interesting to have that navigation.
I think I mentioned before the kind of like, or we've talked about, maybe it was just you and me, James, about like friendship and sex and like what is the relationship built on, and like the disadvantage that I had felt I was at because most of my relationships have been built on sex.
Something I will say here certainly is that over the course of my own life, as I've, grown in size and as I've sort of owned more and more my identity within gaining and my confidence, and the shame element has dissipated, I've certainly found that when it comes to dating, I feel a confidence in being very upfront about this aspect of who I am. First date, just so you know, I'm a gainer. What does that mean if you've never heard of it? I'm gonna get fat. And you need to be ready for that when it happens. So get on or get off. Well, if you want to get off, get on. But that's a totally different story. But I certainly think that element of frankness and honesty and openness really does help, because I think the problem sometimes that we have as gainers trying to navigate the civilian spaces is the ideas that people have about gaining are typically very not good and usually very not correct as to who we are. Like, I have gainer on my profile. My partner and I are polyopen, and if I'm on the apps and I say to a guy, well, you're looking really cute, and he replies with like, I don't like gainers because I don't want to get fed fatter. And I'm like, baby, first of all, that's the feeders. Like, and also, they don't operate from a place of non-consent. Like, if anything, I'm the gainer. I would make you feed me. I'm gonna eat your donuts, not the other way around, bitch. Like, the food is for me. Calm down. But, people don't know. And so sometimes that frankness and that firmness in, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, this is how I experience what I'm experiencing, this is what I like, this is what I want to do. Sometimes that element and that confidence really helps the civilian partner to go, okay, like, I can work with that more solid framework of, I know where they're at, I know what they're doing, and because they have a firmness and a confidence in what they're doing, I can have a confidence in how I'm going to make my own decisions, how I'm going to play off that to know how to navigate and interact, which, some people are more monogamously driven, some people have different caveats for whatever reason. It's all very valid. But I think when I consider how I enmesh my idea of gaining into, my current relationship and past relationships, it certainly comes from a place of, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And you just need to, you either need to be with that or you need to leave me alone about that, And I'd be curious, like, for each of y'all, do you feel like, your gaining journey is something that, is kind of holy for you? Or do you feel like the journey that you want to have is something that you want to specifically share with someone else? Because I feel like there are people who are like, I'm only going to gain if I have a partner who's going to support me in this. Or I'm only going to go past a certain size if I've got someone who's in the community, knows what's what. So the question is, do you feel like you have a part of you that needs to have that other person involved? Or maybe you feel like you can kind of go it on your own?
I feel like that's something that a lot of people are struggling with these days, in terms of being like, oh, I don't want to gain unless it's with someone else, or I don't want to be a part of a relationship unless it's based around gaining, or I'm going to hide this part of myself from my partner. So like, I feel like there's a lot of, I'm trying to figure out the right word. There's a lot of fear around talking about this openly with a partner. But there's also the fact that like you're not doing anyone any favors by keeping it to yourself. It's just gonna, whenever you hide something, that's going to be what kind of emerges later, and it's going to be a problem. So I have a lot of friends who are happily married in civilian relationships, and their partner just doesn't know that they're into the scene at all. And I'm just like, how do you do that? That's so, like, that to me is stranger, or that to me is harder than being like, hey, this is what I'm into. Are you cool with this? Is it fantasy? Is it reality for you? There's a big disconnect there as well. But yeah, in terms of having like solid relationships with people, especially when you're coming with this scene, we have this idea that there's going to be one gainer, one encourager, or two gainers, or like it'll be like there's this idea that it's going to be this idyllic relationship because you're connecting on something so guttural. And yes, you do have like a kickstart to the kink. You understand each other, you can get each other, but that's really not enough to base a relationship off of. That's just a part of a relationship. That's just one small factor of things. And in the end of the day, your fetishes are almost one of the least interesting things, least present things about you. So really, if you're just stuck with a shitty human, you know, don't be stuck with a shitty human. Recognize that if there's someone you can't be open with, then maybe there's something holding you back. And is that you, or is that your fear of them? Is it your fear of the reaction? Or is it just maybe you're not in the right place? I'm going to convince a lot of people to leave their partner. No, I feel like I know it's kind of a lot that I'm kind of talking about, but these are philosophies I adhere to, where I'm just like, I'd rather be open and honest and be like, yo, this is me. This is what I'm into. And I'm just like, sometimes I'm bigger, sometimes I'm smaller, sometimes I'm neither, sometimes I'm both. So by hiding yourself, you're not doing anyone any favors. Just be open, be honest. And if they don't like it, they can kick rocks, or maybe it's not the right situation.
Well, no, I think that you bring up like a good point, especially in the gaming community. There are so many ties to shame there that need to be like unraveled and navigated, just in terms of like, for some people they love like the teasing and everything. I'm not particularly into that myself, but it's like there's so much tied up into like body size and shame, like within just like the normal world, like, and then like just zooming out and then zooming back into the gaming world, it ties so closely to it for so many of us, that it's like it's very important to speak on that and understand where you are on that spectrum. Do you know, like, does that make any sense?
I actually want to build off of that, if I may, for a second,
Yeah.
because there's a big part of fetish theory is that your greatest desires come from your greatest shames. And so like a lot of time your kinks are rooted in something that is considered at once shameful. So I think it's interesting that you brought that point up, because I'm just like, yes, that's very interesting, and you're hitting the nail on the head. Sorry to interrupt.
No, no, please interrupt. I was kind of losing the thread a little bit, but like what you were talking about just sort of brought that to the top of mind. So it's just like it's an interesting way to navigate. And what you were saying about like not having the relationship be focused on gaining, I think like as we all have encountered or had our experiences within the gaining community, we do understand that like just having a mutual interest in this from whatever end of the spectrum you are, whether it's gainer to gainer, feeder to like gainer, encourager, whatever, like it's certainly not enough to sustain an interesting or healthy even friendship most of the time. Everyone has their own interests, I guess. Everyone's a unique snowflake, and they don't always mesh.
How many conversations do we have online that are, hey, what's up? Not much. You, what's up?
Or they go nowhere. Nice belly. Thanks.
That's an interesting point that you brought up about how fetishes spring from a place of shame. Because I was thinking, well, then how does like, why am I into macrophilia then? And I'm like, must be public humiliation, or like public, like being a display in public, because like a lot of macro fantasies surround a situation where someone like grows in a public place, and it's either embarrassing or it's menacing. But I'm like, yeah, maybe that's what it is. Maybe I just have a fear of being singled out.
I mean, blueberry kink is basically just gainer flavored switch taming. You know, it's the whole like, ooh, you're not gonna get me. Oh, I'm gonna eat this blueberry pie. Oh no, the consequences of my actions. What are you gonna do to me? Juice me and roll me around the hill. You know, like it's again, it's interesting that sometimes as gainers, we play this song and dance to ourselves where we're like, oh my God, my desire to be fat is so weird and so strange and so wild that no one could ever possibly understand me. And then every other fetishist next door is just like, dude, this is very translatable. Like, I think sometimes we build that up for ourselves, and I think that kind of ties into that shame thing. We create this mountain, this insurmountable wall where we go, well, this is why I can't move forward. This is why I can't gain. This is why I can't find a partner because it's all just too much, and I don't know how anyone does this. When really it's actually not a problem at all, and it's we get ourselves tangled up in those shame elements. And I think focusing on shame for a second here is an important thing that many of us need to address. Like I was saying before, if you don't unpack your internalized fat phobia, it doesn't matter if you gain from 100 pounds to 500 pounds. If you don't unpack that shit, you are still going to be dealing with really negative consequences within yourself. You are going to be constantly struggling with your desire to be fat and how you otherwise feel. And, you know, Cam, to put you here for a second, you know, as the encourager enable side of things, this is often discussed in gainer circles, right? Like, the gainers are the ones gaining the weight, right? Like, we walk out of the dalliance, the feeding session larger. We carry the responsibility of that. Whereas, you know, on the other side of things, the other person doesn't have to. And I wonder, for yourself, do you ever feel like that adds a layer to the things you have to navigate when it comes to potential gainer meetups or the idea of like a relationship with a larger person?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot there. I want to address that like quickly. I think on that point about shame, I think what's very interesting is like obviously kinks, fetishes are a wonderful thing. No one should ever feel like ashamed for them. But sometimes I feel like the focus on this as a kink make people forget that like fat people just exist in the world. Like you can just walk outside and see them. And it's like when you're existing as a fat person, people aren't mind readers. They're just going to see like, oh yeah, like he's like a fat guy. They're not going to think like, oh my gosh, like when he closes the door, he like gets tied up and called a piggy. Like that's not what people are thinking. And sometimes people's focus on like the kink aspect just, I think it's something that makes it hard for them to remember like, I'm just like a fat guy and I should just enjoy living as that. To your, like your specific question, certainly you have to navigate those points. It's irresponsible to like understand the sort of like discrepancy in the positions that you have, because this is unlike most kinks, it's one that's 24/7. You can see the effects on the body. It changes the way you live and move and interact in the world. And I think that is I think that's why like gaining dynamics or like gaining like relationship dynamics are the way that they are is because of that imbalance. And I think that leads on like I don't want to say like a both sides kind of thing where it's like both parties are like in the wrong necessarily, but I think it leads to both gainers and encouragers behaving in ways that aren't necessarily conducive to like healthy relationships at times. I think for like on the encourager side, I think it's why so many people are very transactional in terms of like, okay, well, like the feed and flee concept. It's like, okay, like, well, I got my like rocks off like deuces. But I think it also leads to a lot of gainers like in understandably being like reserved and restrained of kind of around encouragers like, okay, are you embarrassed if I meet your friends in public, are you going to be embarrassed of me? But I think where it can go wrong is a sort of like, I think at times there are gainers who feel like, okay, well, you must be one of those like shitty encouragers. And it makes the interactions that they have with other encouragers like stilted because of that. And so it's like they want to see you put in a lot of like front end to like prove that, which is understandable, but sometimes not always like realistic, just because when you're trying to get to know somebody, it should be a little more mutual. It shouldn't necessarily be like, oh, the ball's entirely in your court. Like you need to prove to me like prove to me you're worthy for like my presence. So it's like that's not the typical way to engage in like the start of a healthy relationship.
I think that certainly brings up a common trope, which is, you know, we all, I think, end up experiencing these elements of not great things in our relationships, and that becomes a trauma that a lot of people decide to turn into a barrier rather than something that they end up having to work through. Like many of us have had experiences, whether in sexual specific circumstances or emotional, relational, where it's abusive. And then we go, oh, I'm going to protect myself from ever having to experience that again by, making this something that I kind of test my next person on. But the problem is when you do that, you're starting from a position of negativity. You're implementing a bad from jump, and a bad that doesn't necessarily apply to that person. And I think that applies, yes, to gaining, but to a number of other different dynamics. And it is a challenge sometimes to recognize that every new connection is a new connection, and you cannot judge them by the actions of the previous. It hints actually that after a breakup, you should do the necessary work that by the time you look to enter a new relationship, you've kind of come back to where you need to be to treat the person as fine again and not have that trauma, which I don't know that a lot of people do. So if that's you, you may want to consider that for the sake of your partner. But I like where this conversation's going, that element of shame and needing to unpack that. I'm curious to ask for y'all, because we talked a bit about, how we kind of bring gaining together in a relationship. Are there aspects to what gaining is like for you that you would say is a requirement versus a negotiable preference? And if so, what are they and how do you define the difference between them? I'll offer up here first. A requirement for me, if you're not going to feed me, we finna be open. Because mama needs to go get her shit done, and you will not stand in my way. I am not putting my bullshit on hold for you. Your dick is not that good. Period. Just telling it like it is. So a requirement for me is the negotiation truth of, I will have this engagement. And if you will not provide it for me, I will seek it elsewhere. And that is a non-negotiable. I will have that. I will feel no shame in the wanting, and I will feel no hesitation in the acquisition of. It is a perm thing. The negotiation would therefore be their engagement in it. If they say, oh, I don't want to do that, that's negotiable. I don't have to have you, my partner, be the person to do it. Kind of like that.
Yeah, same. But I feel like that speaks more towards just a queer relationship in general, like being what is the term for it? Ethically non-monogamous, or just poly or open. Like that extends just beyond gaining. But the tie-in is there too. So I would say yes, in my relationships, that would also be something that is more of like a necessity. If you're not going to like engage with it or be positive or want to engage in it, then I will go seek that elsewhere, because that is a kink that I would like to explore. So that is something that would be necessary to communicate right at the jump. And like for me, I don't know about for y'all, but like I don't particularly need my partner to want to engage in gaining or to share that fetish with me. Like that is mostly a me thing, which you asked that question a long time ago. So for me, just to backtrack slightly to that, it would be mostly focused on me, go figure, gaining being like a narcissistic focus, or at least just be neutral in it. I wouldn't want negativity towards it if I were with a partner, but usually, like at least for me, inhabiting a larger body, most of the people that are talking to me or would be attracted to me are attracted to the fact that I inhabit a larger body. So it doesn't, like, it's never necessarily a conversation that needs to happen.
See, I'm still at that midpoint place where I'm kind of like I'm too fat for the gay community, but I'm like normal sized for everybody else, right? And then there's like certain guys within the queer community who are into the daddy thing, so that's why I leaned into it, because they're more forgiving about body types. But and even though like the criteria that I have for my partnership is the same as what you guys just mentioned, I'll say that like for any kind of hookups that happen within the gainer community or any hookups that happen in general, either I'm the fat guy or someone else is the fatter person. Like there's going to be some body worship happening. So either you're going to do it to me or I'm going to do it to you. That's non-negotiable. That's going to happen. And if you are a chubby person and you may not necessarily be in the gainer world, please don't be weird about me paying attention to your belly, because that is the part of your body that I am going to be the most fascinated with. That's the part I'm going to play the most with. I'm going to bury my face in it. I'm going to kiss it. I'm going to do all kinds of things to it. Please don't be weird about that. That's usually the only two stipulations.
No, I feel like that's very coming from, as I said before, I don't know how much I've told about my story on the podcast before, but coming from when I first did the Gain project, I was very mindful, and my husband at the time, I was very open about them being like, this is what I want to do. And then one day while we were driving up to his parents' house, he's just like, I no longer find you attractive because you're fat. And that was one of those moments where I was just like, okay, there is something fundamentally wrong with what I'm doing. And that's why coming into my new relationships, everything kind of post divorce, I've been like radically open and been like, this is what I'm into. If you're not into it, then cool. We don't have to do anything together. But like it's a part of my sexuality, and it's part of what I enjoy, and it's part of what I do. So that's been a big part of my own thing. And in my current relationship, even though we're not a sexual pairing, like there's still the respect, and there's still like, he's just like, oh, do you think that's hot? And just like, yeah, I do. But it's not coming from a mean place. It's coming from a place of like gentle teasing and, that sort of thing. It's known and it's accepted and it's fun.
I think a big requirement for me, and I was thinking about this question in the lead up to it, and I honestly could not come up with an answer for like a preference. I'm still trying to like figure that out, but certainly a requirement that has stuck with me is the relationship with food, but not necessarily about like the types of food, but more so I think again, like everyone engages in gaining in a different way. It's like I prefer someone who is where it feels a little more natural. It's not so much like I need them. They're looking to me to be the person that is like pushing them to like eat. And if I'm not pushing them, then it's just not going to happen. Like it's more of like this is sort of like what they're doing anyway. And then I can come in and complement that. And so if I think if that's not there, that's just like a mix match where both of us just aren't going to be happy. So I think that for both of our sakes is important, but also just like the relationship with with their body, not so much like I have had my fair share of experiences with bigger civilians, and it's so hard, especially when like I am skinny as a beanpole. I have not lived as a fat person. I don't know like their experience, and so I can provide them support, but I can't say like, oh, I know how you feel. And so I feel, because they know that I'm attracted to their size, I feel like I'm the last person they want to hear certain affirmations from when they're feeling down about themselves. And that kind of puts me in an awkward position because it's like they're struggling with their own internalized fat phobia. And I don't want to like call them out, but I do want to be like, I understand where you're coming from, but like this is a fat phobic like place this is coming from. And I don't mean that to like lambast you, but like, I want you to recognize that. And so I think just the level of comfort that they have with their body is important as well. Everyone has down days, of course. No one's ever 100% confident all the time. But if it's like a persistent, like, oh, like, I don't know, like I think that's difficult to navigate.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this actually brings up a topic that I like to talk to people about just casually, right? Because within gaining spaces, we only ever seem to really talk about the fulfillment of gaining through a sexual lens, which is ironic considering how many gainers identify on the ace spectrum, right? I have found over the course of time that I have actually gleaned far more satisfaction, shall we say, through gainer friendships than I actually have through gainer dalliances. And of course, there have been plenty of instances of feeding and body worship and all the other good stuff that we love to do. But what I find is I have my partner with whom I get to live the gainer lifestyle that I want to live. And that's the fulfillment for gaining within me. And then when I have my social element with the other gainers, I go, oh yes, this sense of community, this sense of understanding and respect. And so when another gainer as well says, oh, hey, you're looking bigger, you're looking really, really good, I don't just go, oh, you're just saying that because you're my friend. I go, oh, that's really lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Like, you see me, you recognize me, you understand why that means a lot to me. And I'm not trying to say that resolves the need for any kind of sexual something with other people. But the reason why I bring this up is because sometimes I think as well, when we talk about the idea of gainer relationships, we again hinge that idea of, in order for me to receive all gainer satisfaction that ever gets talked about, I must have a partner and they must be another gainer and it must be like this. Otherwise it will not work. And yet, when we diversify our portfolio, shall we say, put eggs in different baskets and invest in different types of relationships in different ways, I find that that satisfaction is sort of ticked off elsewhere. So even though I still have the need for gainer sexy times, that need is not as potent as it once was, because I'm recognizing that I get that fulfillment through other means.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's the same for me. Like I had to realize a while ago that I'm most likely not going to end up in a feeder gainer kind of situation long term, right? So that is fulfilled by this community. That's fulfilled by the trips that I've gone on with you guys, the people that I've met, the conversations that we have here on the podcast, the conversations we have privately. Like it feeds my soul. And the Grommr that I've gone to, like I've said a million times, if you can go to a Grommr and go and enjoy yourself, it'll do you a world of good because it just feeds your soul to be around people who understand you on that level.
I kind of wanted to touch, James, on what you were just saying about feeling fulfilled in gaining without necessarily the need for a relationship. And certainly, like, I agree. That's just indisputable. If you go to like any event, hang out with like friends in the community, like you will feel fulfilled. I think where that's like very tricky because I've heard similar statements, but it has only ever been from other gainers that like they feel fulfilled like without necessarily the need for a relationship. Whereas like if you are like an encourager or a feeder, it's a little trickier because I can't like feed myself. It's not the same enjoyment. That's just basic care for my body. But it takes two to tango when you're an encourager. And if you're a gainer, you can do all those things by yourself. Obviously, you would prefer to do it with someone else. That's way more fun, but it's not something you're required to do. It's not, you can feel like comfortable in your own body, but I need someone else to do things with. And that's sort of it's a tricky place to navigate because it's like, how do you feel fulfilled in a more sexual and a more like romantic, all that fun stuff way when you need someone else? And like hookups can be fun. It can be a nice little kiki, but then you go back home and it's like, well, that was just like for a moment. And it's difficult to navigate. I don't know what the answer is. I've thought a lot about it, but it's pretty hard.
I mean, let me put out there to Matti and to Bobby, like, have y'all had much experience with specifically encouragers, feeders, enablers, and what have those experiences been like for y'all? Maybe there's something that we can explore there that maybe pulls a thread to go on.
I feel like we've had a couple experiences with feeders and encouragers through the years. There was never anything serious. There was never any relationship that I myself took seriously. I'm not saying that the encouragers didn't, but for me, there was just never that connection, never anything that was really grounding. And as much fun as they were, and I would love to do them again, and we'll do them again, and like we'll have more experience in the future. I question whether I could have a relationship that's built exclusively off of that. But mainly because the thing that it makes, I always have this tendency to be like, I'll get to a certain point, and then my instinct will be like, no, rebel, go through a wild phase, go crazy, get out of your funk. And like that's been my pattern in the past. And I'm just like, I doubt any relationship built off of just a single feederism trait. I doubt anything like that would prosper in my life outside of the world of like building upon a solid framework of relationship first, friendship first, and then have this as like the fun cherry or the fun kicker. I can't go into any relationship that's just like, oh, this is what it is. This is what it's all about. It's always about chemistry. Chemistry is huge.
Mm-hmm.
That's
for me. I would say none of my relationships have really been founded on gaining, like to date. I mean, I've only had like several like long-term relationships. The dalliances in gaining with encouragers have been all across the board because I mean, like, as I'm sure like most of you would know, and anybody who's listening to this who is a gainer, like there's a world of difference in terms of the encounters you can have with encouragers and feeders and admirers, where you're, you know, you feel connected to one, like you have that sort of friendship, there's mutual interest there, you both have interesting things to say, the conversation just kind of flows naturally. And then there's, you know, you have a really fulfilling experience. Maybe you don't actually like get to engage in all like the feeding and the eating and whatever and the body worship that you were thinking about going to, but it was just like such a fulfilling experience outside of the engagement in the fetish that you walk away having a better experience than you would with like an encourager or a feeder that you meet up with, and there's just like a table full of food and they pump you full of it, and at the end of it you just sort of feel like a sack that they've like put the food into, and there's no connection there. It's just like a weird sort of like objectifying experience that you had. Like, it's just there's so many there's as many ways to have these encounters as there are feeders and gainers to have them, so it doesn't seem like it would be sustainable really to try to build a relationship off that, unless you have that like glass slipper moment, which I hope everybody does get to experience. I certainly haven't particularly experienced that yet, but maybe one day.
I feel like it brings up the sort of point that we come to in relationship talks in general, which is that it is all down to the person that you're talking to and the person that you're with. So, Cam, maybe that ends up being the honest answer. How you navigate that as an encourager, a feeder, an enabler, is that it's continuing to connect with people and finding out what that correct way forward is with the other person. Which ultimately I think comes down to gaining as well, right? Like we were talking about this before, like it's about the honesty and the upfrontness and building that with that person from jump. So really, I think sometimes, again, when people kind of get caught up in the idea of like, well, what do you do with gaining in relationships? Like it is just the same thing as any other relationship. It is just communicate, honesty, and not settling for someone who isn't willing to navigate your requirements, right? We talked about this with Feed Me Daddy previously. Life is short, date within your kink. And so I think if the hesitation there is you could date someone, but you just don't want to engage with the kink element, engage with the kink element, because if you can, why not? But if the question is, how do you find someone who is willing to engage with you? The question shouldn't be, how do I do this instead of this? It should be, how do I do it all together, right?
Yeah.
And again, maybe that comes back to that shame element. People try to subdivide and say, no, there's the relationship element and then the gaining element and then they're separate, which they can be. But I think sometimes it's that question of, do we understand how everything kind of interworks within ourselves? Like within gaining, again, we talk about sex as a satisfaction so often, and it's like, but what does gaining look like from a friend perspective, from an intellectual perspective, from a romantic perspective, not just, I like fat, I want to come, And I think maybe that's part of it. We just need a bit more language beyond.
Mm-hmm.
What are your biggest concerns in a relationship? As in, what are the things that you've got your eye on the most? What are the things that you want to be most considerate of when it comes to relationships in general?
Well, I feel like there's always, whenever it's any relationship, the big thing is always you're afraid of being rejected. That is ultimately every relationship's fear. And to be fair, most relationships you will be rejected in. Most of your 99% of the relationships you have are sexually rejected relationships, because it's with friends, it's with coworkers, it's with people down the street. Those are all still relationships. It's just there's not that sexual component to it. So the fact of having the one relationship that's supposed to not be rejected, having that one be also a fear, having that fear of rejection also in that relationship that you're trying to establish as something or trying to grow into something, it's a lot for people because they're having to handle that, and they're also having to go a bunch of different ways. So yeah, I feel like in any relationship, to be open and honest and communicative, it's hard because you ultimately want this person to accept you and love you and have all of that. So bringing that fear into things, it's hard. It's just hard.
I mean, I think, and I kind of already mentioned it, and like we've already talked about it, like the Ozempic boon, and my biggest concern is not a partner losing weight. It's a change in relationship with their own body. It's like, as you get bigger, certain challenges come up, and maybe they feel like fine. It's like, yeah, I don't mind having to fly Southwest because I don't want to get charged for 2 plane tickets. But maybe one day it's like, oh shit, was literally a challenge to put my socks on. I kind of hate this. I want to like this isn't for me anymore. And it's kind of like, well, shit, like it's their body, it's their prerogative, that's totally fine. But I think where it gets difficult is if it's like a change in like how they see themselves. If it's like one day it's like, oh my gosh, I love being fat, like it's great. And the next day it's like, I don't know, I just think I'm not healthy. And it's like, well, babe, there's a lot of ways to be healthy that doesn't necessarily correlate to like losing weight. But then again, that gets back to like, well, you're just saying that because you're like an encourager and you want me fat and it's like the whole spiel. And it's very difficult to deal with that because there's lots of valid reasons why someone may feel like, yeah, this weight thing, it's been fun, but XYZ reason has come up and now I need to change that. And navigating that is very difficult because again, it's not my body. They need to be happy first and foremost. But certainly, because like I think we've all seen examples of it where someone may have like been gaining and enjoy it, but then something happens and next thing you know, they're kind of like a different person and the feelings and positions they have seem like completely night and day. And it's like, well, shit, like where does that leave you?
Well, I think that like with gaining in particular, there needs to be less of a focus on it being a static one-way street. Like you're not always going to it, you're a human, you're inhabiting a human body. That's not something that's going to be the same throughout like the entire length of that body's lifespan. You're going to get heavier, you're going to get lighter. It's not like I guess tying back into like the shame thing or whatever, it's not like you don't have to be the size that you are now. You can be larger or smaller, and it doesn't invalidate your gaining journey in any way, Like if you're, if you gain too much and then your knees start hurting and you have to pull it back a little bit because you don't want to be encumbered in that way. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like between the encourager or the gainer, as long as you're both like cognizant of that, and that it's not necessarily just going to be like I'm only going to get larger thing, then that, you can probably circumvent that's becoming an issue.
Definitely. I think, that idea, for instance, of like, oh, what would it mean if that person decided to lose weight and how do I feel about that? Like, that's just, I think, any change in a relationship, like navigating that with discussion. Like, in that regard, I think, an encourager, let's say, broadly and gainer come together, there is an agreement that as much as we're going to be in relationship with one another, there is an intrinsic element of one will grow and one will help that person to grow. Bobby,
Well,
we want to jump in there?
Yes, I got the thought back that
Oh,
Matt was saying. He was saying something about being vulnerable in the relationship and like being able to be open to that. But I think the point that I was thinking of is that like in being in a relationship with anyone, whether that's romantic, friendship, or just like mutual admiration, like an intrinsic part of that is being open to be vulnerable and be rejected, like in that way. Not that you're wanting to be rejected, but it like jumping
It's a part
into
of
that
things.
relationship or being it, having it be serious, like that is an intrinsic part of that, and it sort of like that's just part and parcel, I think, of being being a human and being able to be open with people and communicating what you want. And
right.
unfortunately, sometimes it does lead to that rejection.
Yeah.
I mean, an example that maybe can be brought up here, right? Like, I'm in a relationship with my partner. My partner is at this stage identifying as cisgender, and if my partner at some stage turns around and says, "Actually, I want to share something with you. I've been thinking about this. I'm doing some exploring. I think that I might be trans. I think that I might be a woman." That becomes something that we need to discuss in our relationship. It might mean that the result of this is that we stay together, and I then say, I'm still in a queer relationship with a woman, trans woman, we navigate that, or the result might end up being that we split. Neither of those options is intrinsically good or bad, because the only correct decision to make is the one that is correct for the pair of us. My partner may feel, if they go on that journey, that they go, oh, well, actually, I think I should be single for this time because I should learn to explore who I am as this gender, as this person, before reintroducing myself to this dynamic. Or maybe they'll say that they want to stick with that because that's going to help them feel safe. I might feel challenged by that. I identify as a queer male who is predominantly gay. What does that mean for me to be in a relationship with a woman? It brings up a lot of questions. But the thing is, I don't know if that's ever gonna happen. I can't know. I can only know that within myself, if that eventuality ever comes to the fore, that I treat my partner with respect and that I think what is going to be best both for themselves and for myself, because our relationship is the meeting point of the two. So I think similarly, in that idea, you would be in a relationship with someone who their idea is they're just a gainer and they're going to keep gaining, and that's the idea. But they may decide that they want to change that journey. They might want to pivot to muscle, they might want to make some edits, they might want to lose all the weight. Who can say? And you can't predict for what that's going to look like or what that will mean for you. But I think depending on who it is, what your relationship is like, in the moment when it happens, similarly, you can only make the best decision what is right for them and what is right for you. If you decide that you want to stay together, maybe the correct decision is to say that if you were monogamous closed, you'll need to open it up so that you can still get what you need to get from other people with consent, respect. That person's journey can be respected. I mean, all of this conversation really comes down to the nitty-gritty of what it means to be in a relationship, which is a delicate dance at times, understanding that you're not just dealing with the person who is consistent. I'm not in a relationship, for example, with the person I started dating 5 years ago. I'm in a relationship with someone who has changed in 5 years. And every day that I wake up and choose that relationship, I choose the person that they are today, same as they choose who I am today. And I hope none of that comes across as a judgment, by the way. I just mean to say that I think, again, sometimes we get caught up in the what if of the moment. And it's not really a question of what if. It's a question of everyone changes. And you have to choose the person as they change and how you're going to inevitably navigate those changes as time goes on. Does that correlate, or do we feel like that's a bit out of...
No, that makes sense. And
I'd say that's
I was gonna offer up as a piece of advice, if you're in a long-term relationship and you're thinking about opening it up, or you have already opened it up, because you have differences in fetishes and kinks, or whatever your reasons may be, make it fair. Don't impose a double standard, and don't let them impose a double standard on you. Sit down and decide, okay, if we're going to open the relationship, if we're going to be poly, or we're just going to allow each other to have hookups, what are the ground rules, and set them and stick to them. Don't break them. The only way that it's going to truly work is if both of you are being open and honest about it. And as someone who was stuck in a double standard open relationship that I didn't even know about until someone else told me about it, that fucking sucks. And so don't do that to your partner, and don't let them do that to you either. At relationships, I think it can go through stages of being open and closed depending on how you feel at the time. But yeah, I can't stand it when people are like, I'm allowed to do whatever the hell I want, but you can't. Because then you're just keeping someone around. You're just keeping someone around to be your doormat, your dog to come home to pet and, ground you again. Like, that's the only reason you're keeping someone around. And that's just horrible. Don't play with someone's emotions like that.
Yeah. Also, like, we as queer people get to navigate unique relationship arrangements. You know what I mean? There's no, like, if monogamy is something that you want to choose for yourself and that your partner also wants to choose within this relationship, and you communicate that and actually stick to that together, then that's great for you. Like, but it should not be the standard that all people base their relationships off of, because then you're not communicating these things, and that's how you do end up in those double standard situations. If you're just both going to be like open and honest, like, with each other in this way, like, then you can both experience a full, like, a more fully satisfying existence within and outside of that relationship. You should, for me, I'll speak for myself, like, I want my partner to be able to experience the full range of their like sexuality or whatever. Like, I want them to explore every aspect of that, like, to the fullest, whether that is with me or not. Because if it's not something I want to engage in, that doesn't mean that it's something that I don't want them to engage in. I want my partner to learn and grow continually, and that should exist independently of me. I should not be like the vehicle they use for that. I mean, in most of the aspects, yes, but like, we're not going to be 100% on the same page every time, and we shouldn't have to be.
The beauty about being queer is not only do we establish our own relationships, but we also establish what those rules are. And with clear and concise communication, you can be like, you can get your rocks off and have a partner who you sleep with or not sleep with, and that's fine. Like, there is no set way in terms of like, this is how a relationship. Straight people think that they have to get married to the opposite gender, and that is life. Once you break that open, there's risks associated with that where people go too far, they exploit or they do other things. But in reality, if you also have the beautiful opportunity to create and structure your own relationship and how it functions. So there is, yeah, that's kind of why I'm always just like clear, concise communication. That's the key to every relationship, and especially in queer ones, is make sure you're being equal, make sure you're being heard, and make sure you're balanced.
And being able to put your trust in the person that you're in the relationship with, to be able to be open with them with your desires and your needs, is something that's important to like keep tying it back into that internalized shame thing. Because the only times that you don't do that are when you feel like you're going to be rejected for the thing that you want to say. That's where the strife comes from every time.
Definitely. I feel like with my own relationship, my partner and I, like I said, we've been together a few years, we're open poly. I feel totally safe to that point with him to express, my desires within Gainin, my struggles with Gainin, and even when he'll have conversations with me about, his own weight as it fluctuates, it's a really interesting opportunity to share in something that I didn't think I would get to have with someone in a way that is very new, but also very well received. I don't know. I think when you find a person that you connect with, no matter how long you've been together for, I think so long as there is that sense of openness, honesty, frankness, I think it invites a sense of that safety to be able to express and to be able to be heard and respected with that as well. Does anyone want to ask anyone else any particular questions?
I guess I'm curious how it works for you, Cameron, in engaging with gainers at the first part. Like you were talking earlier about feeling like you need to prove yourself to like the big boys that you're talking to. Like,
Yeah.
where has that come from, like in your experience? Because obviously I've only existed on the other end of that spectrum, so I've never really heard the side of
Yeah.
things.
I think it's like, and it's funny because we were just talking about like how the straights do things versus how the gays do things. And I think like, yes, 100% true. I think something that a lot of folks don't necessarily appreciate in this community is that I think we have taken a bad lesson from the straights and how we do dating. I think a lot of gainers have this expectation that the encourager should sort of be like the man and kind of like you need to be the one like messaging first. You need to be the one like, doing something to indicate like, okay, you're like a good suitor. Like, can you send like money to me? Like, can you like, provide like something for me that like indicates that yes, you would be able to be a good like feeder to me. And I think a lot of that is, I think something that kind of touches on like what are you building that relationship off of? Because obviously building it solely off of a kink is just does not usually make for a solid relationship foundation. But mostly I'm just referring to this, at least the impression that I have gotten a lot of times, that the onus is really on the encourager to sort of like make something happen. And it's because like, this is a community where like the focus is on the fat, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I wouldn't have it any other way. But that means that when you're not fat, then it's sort of like they have the relationship capital, they have the social capital, where there's a different expectation on like who's desirable and who gets to like have people come to them, and vice versa.
How do you think that plays off of just the general rejection that fat people experience in the world outside of like the kink of gaining? Because usually, like, just to speak to that, I'm not going to be as open to talking to like a fit bodied or a thinner person, because oftentimes, like in the past, when I have done that or approach, they hit you with immediate rejection in a way that feels kind of gross. So like as the gainer, I feel like that maybe that is why that has that structure's flipped.
Yeah. No, I certainly think that's a part of it. I think like an interesting, like a common refrain I will see gainers like say in the time I've been like in the gainer community is like, well, maybe it is like this, but like that's fine because when we go out in the world, like we get treated this way, and they're 100% right. And then on the flip side of that, they'll say like, well, you can go into like, civilian gay spaces and you're celebrated. And I also think that's right. I think where the difficulty is that like, and not all like encouragers are the same, but at least for me, like I don't really give a shit. yeah, I could go on Grindr and probably have like plenty of success there. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. And so where I think it's difficult is that like this is my community, this is the community that I care about. And so when the like dynamics and the treatment that I get is the way it is, it's a bit frustrating because it is kind of like, well, shit, like not to say that you can't just pretend that the wider world doesn't exist and that like societal fat phobia doesn't permeate the ways that we like interact in this community, obviously. But I think that is you have to acknowledge it, but I also don't think that should control like all interactions in the community in the way that we see one another. I think that we have to recognize that like and you can like, come on now, like you can tell when someone has like some fat phobic opinions. You can tell in the way they talk, the opinions they espouse. And so if you see that, then like certainly like that's like that could be a red flag and you treat them accordingly. But if you aren't really picking up those vibes, then it's like, don't project that there.
I think this is a really good conversation, and I think it's frustrating because in many ways it almost feels like we're just like scraping the surface, right? Like this is obviously such like a big conversation and everyone's going to have different opinions. Even the people listening to this might be like, my experiences are wildly different, my perspectives are opposite end of the spectrum. So I'd like to encourage all to write into us at thegainproject@gmail.com. Let us know what you think, comment on our posts, talk to us about the thing, and who knows, maybe we'll have to have this conversation again. But I think that brings us to the end of another fantastic week here on Thicc Radio. Where can our listeners find each of you online?
Right. You can find me on Instagram at laissezsusan. That's LAISSEZ Susan. And if you have any problems with anything that I said, you can send those to the Captain Barra. Just DM. You could DM him. You could DM him about it.
You can find me on the Gainin Project or on my civilian side, which is the Big Shabam.
Y'all can find me on Instagram at biggerisbest7 and on Twitter, biggerisbest7 there as well.
Oh yeah, and BlueSky also at Lazy
And BlueSky. I'm there. I just started this week.
And the Butterfly app, Diva, since Twitter is going down.
Right.
Well, that's a wrap for now here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. Now listen, if you liked this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, please share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me, as always, on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at ThiccyMouse. You can also look us up on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or on our website at podpage.com/ThiccRadio. If you want to submit a voice note or become a financial supporter of the show, you can find the links in the show notes, and you can always write to us at thethiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stan and Thicky.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by laissezsusan.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.